One type of factoring that we do is something called factor by grouping. And factor by grouping is what we're going to use when we have 4 terms in our polynomial. So our first example, x squared plus 2x plus 4x plus 8, is a polynomial with 4 terms. So when it's factored by grouping, what we're going to do is we are going to group our first 2 terms together and then group our second 2 terms together. We're actually going to factor these separately, which makes it a little bit easier because we get to factor using our greatest common factor. So first thing we're going to do is look at our first polynomial, or our first group of x cubed plus 2x squared, and we want to figure out what the greatest common factor is between these 2 terms. And if you figure out, we have a 1 in front and a 2, well, there's nothing that goes into both 1 and 2 other than 1, and then you have an x cubed and an x squared, which means the number of x's that they have in common is x squared. So our greatest common factor is an x squared. And we're going to factor an x squared out of every term, and that's why it ends up out front right there. So when you factor an x squared out of your x cubed, we say how many x's are left after we factor out an x squared. Because there's 3 x's, you'll be left with just an x. And then our second term, because we didn't factor a number out, this 2 is going to stay the same, so it'll be plus 2. And then we have x squared, but we factored an x squared out, which means you don't have any x's left in that term. So we factored out our greatest common factor from our first 2 terms, and we got this x squared parentheses x plus 2. Alright, when you guys factor by grouping, I always want you to bring your middle sign down, whether it's a plus or minus, because I know that that plus is going to go right there. And now we're going to figure out our greatest common factor of our last 2 terms. So we have a 4x plus 8, and the biggest factor that fits into both 4x and an 8 is just a 4. So we're going to factor a 4 out of both of these terms. When you factor out a number, it works like division. So this 4, when you factor out a 4, so there's the 4 we're going to factor out, you are left with just a 1, and then the x did not get factored out, so we have just a 1x. And then when you factor a 4 out of 8, we take 8 and divide it by 4, and we get a positive 2. Alright, so one thing I want to point out, now that we have factored our 2 groups separately, these sets of parentheses should always be exactly the same. If they're not exactly the same, that means that somewhere in this first step when we were taking out our GCF, we must have made a mistake. So here's your checkpoint. Do your parentheses match? If they do, then we continue on. From here we have 2 groups. You've got this group here and this grouping here, and you want to figure out what they have in common, and it always will be that set of parentheses. So what we're going to do is we're going to factor out the set of parentheses so that x plus 2 goes out front, and we'll keep it in parentheses, and then in our second set of parentheses will just be what you have left over. Well, if you take the x plus 2 out of this group, you're just left with the x squared. So that's going to be our first term. And then if you take the x plus 2 out of this group, you're left with that 4 right there. And because it's positive, we're going to say plus 4. And this factor by grouping is done. Alright, I'll go through another example. Let me scroll up. So we see this problem on a quiz or test, and we say, oh, there's 4 terms that must be factored by grouping. So we group our first 2, and we group our second 2. Now the first 2, the greatest common factor that we can take out of both terms is going to be a 3, and then an x squared. And then parentheses. Now if you take that 3x squared out of both terms, from this first term, you take a 3x squared out and you are left with just a 1x or an x. And then plus, if we factor a 3x squared out of our second term, you take this 6 and divide it by the 3 that we factored out, so that's why we're going to see a 2. And then the x squared got factored out front, so that one is done. Alright, and then if you remember I said whatever your middle sign is always going to come down, so that's going to be a minus. And now, what can we factor out of our second group of 2x minus 4? Well, you have a 2x minus 4, our greatest common factor will be a 2, parentheses. Well, if you factor a 2x out of this 2x, you are left with just the x. And then here's where the fact that we brought down that minus sign is going to help us out. Next we have a negative 4. Well, technically we're factoring out a negative 2 down here, so this negative 4 divided by that negative 2 ends up being a positive 2. And here's where we'll check, do our parentheses match? You have an x plus 2 and an x plus 2. They match, which means we just have our final step of factoring the x plus 2 out front. And then in our second set of parentheses, you're going to take your 3x squared and this minus 2. And we have factored by grouping. The more you practice this, you get the hang of it. It's really not too bad because it basically uses your factoring using your GCF, which is nice.